Hello everyone. Let's label together the skull figures. We have 5 different figures, starting with the first one. First, we will identify the bones. This right here is the frontal bone. We have one frontal bone. This is the parietal bone. We have 2 parietal bones. This is on the side, we have the temporal bone. We have 2 temporal bones. This is the occipital bone in brown. We have one occipital bone. This is the sphenoid bone in pink. We have one sphenoid bone in the skull. This is the ethmoid bone in orange. We have one ethmoid bone in the skull. This is the lacrimal bone in green. We have 2 lacrimal bones. In blue, we have the nasal bone. We have 2 nasal bones. This is the mandible. We have one mandible as one bone. This is the maxilla. We have 2 maxilla. The maxilla holds the teeth of the upper jaw, whereas the mandible holds the teeth of the lower jaw. We have the zygomatic bone. We have 2 zygomatic bones. Now moving to the sutures. This right here is the coronal suture. The coronal suture is located between the frontal bone and the parietal bone. This is the squamous suture between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. This is the occipito-mastoid suture between the occipital bone and the mastoid process of the temporal bone. That is the occipito-mastoid suture. And we have the lambdoid suture. We can see part of the lambdoid suture. Moving to the structures of the temporal bone. First, this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Don't confuse the zygomatic bone right here with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This opening is the external acoustic meatus right here. This process is the mastoid process. It looks like half an M. So that is the mastoid process. And this is the styloid process, which look sharper than the mastoid process. Moving to the parts of the bones, first of all, we can see the greater wing of the sphenoid right here. That's a greater wing. This tiny depression right here, this is the lacrimal fossa. These are the alveolar processes right here on both the mandible and the maxilla. This opening in the mandible is the mental foramen. So remember that we have two mental foramen, one on each side in the mandible. This part of the mandible is the coronoid process. Check out my video on the anatomy of the mandible to understand its structures. So that is the coronoid process right here, whereas posteriorly, this right here is the condylar process. So don't confuse the coronoid process with the condylar process. In between them, we have a notch. This is the mandibular notch. This arm-like structure, this is the mandibular ramus. This angle right here, this is the mandibular angle. So we labeled the parts of the mandible. Moving to the second figure. First, this is the maxilla. Second, this is the palatine bone. The maxilla and the palatine bone together, they form the hard palate. So two bones. Notice how the palatine bone is on the posterior aspect toward the occipital bone. This right here is the zygomatic bone. This is the temporal bone. In pink, this bone is the sphenoid bone, only in pink. Whereas this bone right here is the vomer bone. We have one vomer bone and one sphenoid bone. This right here, we can see part of the parietal bone. And this is the occipital bone, also called the occipital bone. We have one occipital bone. Inferior to the orbit, we have an opening which is called the infraorbital foramen. The orbit is the bony eye socket. So infraorbital foramen is an opening inferior to the orbit. There is an opening in the sphenoid bone, which is the bone in pink. This opening right here is called the foramen spinosum. This right here is the foramen ovale, another opening in the sphenoid bone. Whereas the foramen lacerum, which is this opening, it is formed by three bones, by the sphenoid bone in pink, the occipital bone in brown, and the temporal bone in orange. So that is the foramen lacerum. The carotid canal is one opening that we can see in the temporal bone in orange. So that right here is the carotid canal. The external acoustic meatus is the second opening we can see through the temporal bone in orange. The stylomastoid foramen is the third opening we can see in the temporal bone as well. Whereas the jugular foramen, it is formed by two bones, by the temporal bone in orange and the occipital bone in brown. The foramen magnum, this is the largest opening in the skull. So right here, we can see the foramen magnum. It is the opening in the occipital bone. As we mentioned earlier, the maxilla and the palatine bone, they both form the hard palate. Right here we can see the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, and we can see the styloid process of the temporal bone. This right here is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. This is in the temporal bone, this fossa is the mandibular fossa, where the temporal bone articulates with the mandible. So that is the mandibular fossa. Previously, we have identified the bones. Let's go over the structures on the occipital bone. So this right here is the basilar part of the occipital bone. This is the external occipital crest right here. This is the external occipital protuberance right here. We have two occipital condyles. They look like a kidney, that's a kidney shape. That's the occipital condyle, which articulates with the first cervical vertebra. This line right here, this is the inferior nuchal line. Whereas this is the superior nuchal line. So this line in the anatomical position is inferior to that line. That's why this is called the superior nuchal line, whereas this is the inferior nuchal line because it is closer to the base of the skull. As we mentioned, this is the foramen magnum. Moving to the third figure, this entire space right here, this is the anterior cranial fossa. We can see it right here. Whereas this is the middle cranial fossa. So basically in this figure, we took the skull cap away. The skull, we can see it with the calvaria removed, which is the skull cap. And we can see the middle cranial fossa right here. Posteriorly, we have the posterior cranial fossa. So the posterior cranial fossa and the middle with the anterior, these are the space in the skull. Let's identify the bones. This is the frontal bone. This is the ethmoid bone. So this right here is the ethmoid bone. In yellow, the frontal bone. We have one ethmoid bone and one frontal bone. In the ethmoid bone, this is the cribriform plate. So this is the cribriform plate. This line right here, this is the crista galli. And the openings in the cribriform plate, they are called the cribriform foramina. So the openings are the cribriform foramina. The entire plate is the cribriform plate. And this is the crista galli. Okay, moving to the sphenoid bone. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, whereas this is the greater wing. So we have two wings, lesser wing and a greater wing. Starting with the first opening in the sphenoid bone, this is the optic canal, where the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number 2, exits the eye through the optic canal and then to the brain. This is the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica, also called the sella turcica. So this saddle-shaped structure in the sphenoid bone is the sella turcica. The second opening, we have the foramen rotundum. So that is the foramen rotundum. Optic canal was the first opening. Foramen rotundum is the second opening. Foramen ovale is the third opening in the sphenoid bone. Foramen spinosum is the third opening. You can remember the clothing store, Ross, to remember the order. Rotundum, ovale, spinosum. This right here is the foramen lacerum. We have two bones that make the foramen lacerum. First, the sphenoid, and the second is the temporal bone. This bone in orange is the temporal bone. Remember, on the outer aspect of the skull, we were able to see the external acoustic meatus. However, in the inner aspect, we can see the internal acoustic meatus to the inside. Moving to the jugular foramen, as we mentioned earlier, it is formed by two bones, by the temporal bone and the occipital bone. This is the occipital bone posteriorly. This is the foramen magnum in the bone. This is the hypoglossal canal. So we have two openings in the occipital bone, which is the foramen magnum and the hypoglossal canal. The foramen lacerum consists of what? Of the combination of two bones, the temporal bone and the occipital bone, as we mentioned earlier. We can see part of the parietal bone. Moving to the fourth figure, first we have the frontal bone. We have two parietal bones. We have two nasal bones. We have one sphenoid bone. We have two temporal bones on the side. We have one ethmoid bone in orange, two lacrimal bones, one zygomatic bone, two maxilla. This is one half, and that is the other one right here. One mandible, one vomer bone, Moving to the frontal bone, let's go over its parts. First, this is the glabella. This is the squamous part of frontal bone, right here. This is the frontonasal suture between the frontal bone and the nasal bone. This is the supraorbital foramen, this opening superior to the orbit, that is the orbit. So this is the supraorbital foramen. This margin right here is the supraorbital margin. That is the sphenoid bone. The first opening in the sphenoid bone, we have the superior orbital fissure. So in that view, we can see the superior orbital fissure, which is a slit-like opening. This is the inferior orbital fissure, which is formed by three bones, the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, and the sphenoid bone. Whereas the superior orbital fissure, it is an opening through the sphenoid bone only. This is the optic canal. So don't confuse the optic canal with the two orbital fissures. Moving to this structure right here, this is the middle nasal conchae. We have two middle nasal conchae, one on each side. This is the perpendicular plate right here. Both structures are part of the ethmoid bone, which is the bone in orange right here. Earlier we mentioned that the crista galli, cribriform plate, and olfactory foramina are also parts of the ethmoid bone. This right here is the vomer, that's another bone. We have one vomer in the skull. Don't confuse the middle nasal conchae with the inferior nasal conchae, which are not part of the ethmoid bone. So these two inferior nasal conchae are not part of the ethmoid bone. This is the maxilla. This opening in the maxilla is the infraorbital foramen, which is inferior to the orbit. This is the orbit right here. This is the mandible. That's the mental foramen. We have two mental foramens in the mandible. And right here we have the mental protuberance, this right here. Moving to the fifth and last figure on the skull. This is the parietal bone. We have two parietal bones. This is the occipital bone. We have one occipital bone. This is the temporal bone. We have two temporal bones. Moving to the sutures, this is the sagittal suture. Also, we can see right here the sutural bones. So what shape are these two bones? These are sutural bones because they are located in a suture. This is the lambdoid suture, which looks like the Greek letter lambda. That is the lambdoid. The lambdoid suture connects both parietal bones with the occipital bone. Whereas this is the occipitomastoid suture. Moving to the two lines, this is the anatomical position of the skull. So this is the superior nuchal line, whereas this is the inferior nuchal line. This is the external occipital crest right here, whereas this is the external occipital protuberance. And lastly, we can see the occipital condyles, which are the kidney-shaped structures around the foramen magnum.